When the vows break. Susan Martin was what you'd call the perfect wife. She taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary for 28 years. Every morning she'd pack Michael's lunch in a brown paper bag with a little note inside. "Have a great day, honey," or "Don't forget, we have dinner with the Johnsons tonight." Small gestures that kept their marriage running like clockwork. Michael worked as an insurance adjuster for Midwest Mutual. Steady job, decent pay, respected in the community. He coached Little League for 12 years, never missed Emily's piano recitals, and every Sunday morning you'd find him reading the Cedar Rapids Gazette while Susan made pancakes from scratch. To anyone looking from the outside, the Martins had what we all dream of: a solid marriage, a beautiful daughter who was now studying nursing at the University of Iowa, and a future that looked as comfortable and predictable as Iowa cornfields in summer. But here's what Susan didn't know, and this is where our story really begins. Michael wasn't just processing insurance claims during those long hours at the office. He was processing something much darker. You see, his father, Charles Martin, owned a successful hardware store downtown, Martin's Hardware. Being in the family since 1952, Charles was getting older, pushing 78, and he'd been talking about updating his will. The store was worth over $2 million, plus he had investments, life insurance policies, and a beautiful Victorian house on the good side of town. Michael had been counting on that inheritance for years, but there was a problem. Charles Martin was a sharp old man, sharper than Michael gave him credit for. And Charles had been watching his son very carefully. He'd noticed things, strange things: money going missing from the store's petty cash, customers complaining about insurance settlements that seemed too low, with Michael somehow always involved. Charles started asking questions, started digging around. And that's when Michael knew he had a problem that wouldn't solve itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that October morning when Susan's world started unraveling, thread by thread. It was Tuesday, October 15th, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you grateful to live in Iowa, with leaves crunching underfoot and the smell of apple cider drifting from the farmer's market downtown. Susan was grading papers at the kitchen table when her phone rang. "Mrs. Martin." The voice was professional, careful. "This is Dr. Peterson from St. Luke's Hospital. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father-in-law." The words every family dreads. Charles Martin had collapsed at the hardware store around noon. "Massive heart attack," they said. The paramedics did everything they could, but by the time they got him to the emergency room, Susan's hands shook as she hung up the phone. Charles hadn't just been her father-in-law, he'd been the father she'd lost when she was 12. When she married Michael, Charles welcomed her with open arms. "You're not just my daughter-in-law," he used to say. "You're my daughter, period." She called Emily at college first, then Michael at work. Strange thing, though, Michael's phone went straight to voicemail. She tried his office line. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, sounded surprised. "Oh, Mr. Martin left early today. Said he had a family emergency to handle. I thought you knew." That's when the first crack appeared in Susan's perfect world, though she didn't recognize it at the time. Michael had known about his father's death before anyone called to tell him. The funeral was set for Friday at Riverside Memorial Chapel. Cedar Rapids isn't a big city everybody knows everybody, especially when you've lived there your whole life. Charles Martin was well respected, had employed dozens of local kids over the decades, donated generously to the United Way. The chapel was packed. Susan wore her navy blue dress, the one she'd bought for Emily's graduation. She sat in the front pew, holding Michael's hand, watching as friends and neighbors filed past Charles's casket. That's when she noticed Michael's behavior. Now, grief affects everyone differently. Some people cry, some people withdraw, some people talk nonstop. But Michael seemed almost relieved. Not sad, not devastated like you'd expect a son to be. Relieved, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. "You okay, honey?" Susan whispered during the pastor's eulogy. Michael squeezed her fingers. "Just thinking about all the loose ends I'll have to tie up. The store, his accounts, the house. It's a lot to handle." But that wasn't what his eyes were saying. His eyes kept darting toward the back of the chapel, like he was watching for someone. That's when Susan turned around and saw her. Even after 30 years, you don't forget your first love. Hannah Brookswell. Hannah Stevens now stood near the chapel doors wearing a black coat and an expression Susan couldn't quite read. Hannah had been Susan's best friend all through high school. They'd shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about the future. Hannah was going to be a journalist, travel the world, write stories that mattered. Then, right after graduation, Hannah vanished. Didn't return phone calls, didn't answer letters. Susan heard through the grapevine that Hannah had gotten married, moved to Chicago. That was 1994. And Susan hadn't seen or heard from her since. Until now. What made Susan's blood run cold wasn't just seeing Hannah after all these years. It was watching Michael's reaction. He'd spotted her too, and instead of surprise or curiosity, his face showed recognition, like he'd been expecting her, like they'd planned this. After the service, Susan tried to catch Hannah's eye, maybe get a chance to talk. But Hannah slipped out during the final prayer, disappearing as mysteriously as she'd appeared. On the drive home, Susan couldn't let it go. "Michael, did you see Hannah Brooks at the service?" Michael kept his eyes on the road. "Hannah who?" "My friend from high school. You remember I've told you stories about her. She was there, in the back. Honey, there were probably 200 people there. I can't keep track of everyone who knew Dad. But Susan had been married to Michael for 30 years. She knew when he was lying. There was a specific way he'd clear his throat, a little pause before he answered. And he was doing it now. That night, while Michael was in the shower, Susan went through his jacket pockets. She told herself she was just checking for tissues before taking it to the dry cleaner. But really, she was looking for something, anything that might explain the Hannah connection. What she found was a dinner receipt from Giuseppe's, the Italian restaurant downtown. Date, October 10th. Total, $87.50. Enough for 2 people. October 10th was the night Michael said he had to work late, processing a complicated claim. Susan remembered because she'd saved him a plate from dinner, kept it warm in the oven until almost 10 o'clock. She stared at that receipt, her heart pounding. One lie might be innocent, might be explainable, but 2 lies? That was a pattern. Now, I need to tell you about Emily, because what happened next wouldn't make sense without understanding the kind of daughter the Martins had raised. Emily was 22, studying nursing, planning to specialize in geriatric care because she'd always had a soft spot for elderly patients. She'd spent countless hours with her grandfather, helping him with his medications, driving him to doctor appointments when Michael was too busy. Emily was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of young woman who noticed details. And lately, she'd been noticing things about her father that didn't add up. It started with Charles's medications. Emily knew her grandfather's routine better than anyone. Morning pills with breakfast, afternoon pills with lunch, evening pills with dinner. Charles had high blood pressure, took medication for his cholesterol, had a prescription for mild anxiety. Nothing unusual for a man his age. But in the weeks before Charles died, Emily noticed changes. Her grandfather seemed confused, sometimes forgetting conversations they'd just had. He complained of headaches, said he felt dizzy. When Emily suggested he talk to his doctor, Charles said something that stuck with her. I told Michael about the symptoms. He said he'd handle it, maybe adjust my medication schedule. The thing is, Michael wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a pharmacist. He sold insurance. But somehow, he was making decisions about his father's medication. Emily tried to bring this up with her mother, but Susan was busy with her students, and Emily was heading back to college. She filed it away as one of those family quirks that didn't seem worth a big discussion, until the morning she found her father's phone. Michael had left it on the kitchen counter while he was outside, scraping ice off his windshield. Emily wasn't trying to snoop. She was looking for her own phone charger when Michael's phone buzzed with a text message. The message was from someone named H. Stevens. Everything went according to plan. No one suspects anything. When do we move forward? Emily stared at that message, her nursing school training kicking in. Everything went according to plan right after her grandfather's sudden death? That couldn't be coincidence. She did what any curious 22-year-old would do. She scrolled up through the message history. What she found made her physically sick. Weeks of messages between her father and this H. Stevens person. Discussions about Charles's medication schedule. References to adjusting the dosage and making it look natural. And then the message that confirmed Emily's worst fears. The insulin went in with his evening pills. Heart attack symptoms should start within hours. Stick to the story we rehearsed. Emily's hands shook as she read those words. Insulin in a non-diabetic person could absolutely cause a heart attack. It was something they'd covered in her pharmacology class just last semester. Her father had murdered her grandfather. Now, put yourself in Emily's position. You're 22 years old. You discover your father is a killer, and your grandfather the man who taught you to drive, who never missed sending you a birthday card, who called you his little nurse because he was so proud of your career choice, is dead because your father wanted his money. What do you do? Call the police? Confront your father? Tell your mother? Emily chose to tell her mother, but not right away. First, she needed proof that would stand up in court. So she did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. She took pictures of her father's phone messages. Susan was grading papers in her classroom after school when Emily showed up, pale and shaking. When Emily showed her those screenshots, Susan felt the world tilt sideways. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about murder. Mom, what are we going to do? Susan stared at the evidence on Emily's phone screen. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to find some innocent explanation. Maybe H. Stevens was a colleague helping with insurance paperwork. Maybe insulin was code for something else. But deep down, Susan knew better. All those little inconsistencies over the years were suddenly making sense. The times Michael volunteered to pick up Charles's prescriptions, the way he discouraged Charles from seeing certain doctors, the financial documents Michael had been having Charles sign. claiming they were routine paperwork. Michael hadn't just killed his father, he'd been planning it for months. "We need to call the police," Susan said. But Emily grabbed her arm. "Mom, what if we're wrong? What if Dad finds out we're suspicious? Those messages, they make it sound like he's done this before." That possibility terrified Susan more than she could express. If Michael was capable of killing his own father, what would he do to protect his secret? They decided to be smart about it. Emily would continue pretending everything was normal, while Susan quietly gathered more evidence. They'd build a case that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. What they didn't know was that Michael was already suspicious. That evening at dinner, Michael seemed different, more attentive, asking Susan about her day, complimenting Emily on her sweater. But his eyes were watchful, calculating. "How are you both handling Dad's death?" he asked during dessert. "I know it's been hard on everyone." "We're managing," Susan replied carefully. Michael nodded. "Good, because I'd hate for either of you to do anything impulsive. Grief can make people think things, see patterns that aren't really there." The way he said it sent chills down Susan's spine. It sounded less like concern and more like a warning. After Emily went upstairs to study, Michael cornered Susan in the kitchen. "Has Emily said anything unusual to you? About Dad? About his death?" Susan forced herself to stay calm. "Like what?" "I don't know. Young people sometimes get ideas, especially when they're studying medicine. They think they understand things they don't really understand. Emily's handling this fine, Michael. We both are." But Michael stepped closer, and for the first time in 30 years of marriage, Susan felt afraid of her husband. "Good," he said, "because some secrets are better left buried." That night, Susan couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to Michael breathe, wondering how many nights she'd done this exact same thing, never knowing she was sleeping next to a killer. Around 2 in the morning she heard Michael get up. She kept her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, as he moved quietly around the bedroom. She heard him open his dresser drawer, heard the rustling of papers. When she was sure he'd gone downstairs, Susan slipped out of bed and checked the drawer. Hidden behind his socks, she found a manila folder containing Charles's medical records, insurance policies, and bank statements. There were also photocopies of prescription bottles and what looked like forged signatures on several documents. But the most chilling discovery was a small notebook with dates and dosages written in Michael's handwriting. The final entry was dated October 14th, the day before Charles died. Final dose administered. Expected cardiac event within 6-8 hours. Susan's hands shook as she photographed the pages with her phone. This was it. This was proof that would send Michael to prison for the rest of his life. She was so focused on documenting the evidence that she almost didn't hear Michael coming back upstairs. Susan barely had time to close the drawer and dive back into bed before the bedroom door creaked open. Michael stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, watching her pretend to sleep. Finally, she heard him move toward his dresser. Susan held her breath, waiting for him to discover that his drawer had been disturbed, that his secrets had been uncovered. But after a moment, he got back into bed. "I know you're awake, Susan." Her blood turned to ice. "I know you've been going through my things. I know Emily's been asking questions." Susan remained perfectly still, hoping he'd think he was wrong. Michael's voice was calm, almost conversational. "The thing about secrets is, they're only dangerous if the wrong people find out about them. Family should stick together." He rolled over, and Susan felt his breath on her neck. I did what I had to do for our future, for Emily's future. Dad was never going to change that will. He was getting suspicious about my business practices, threatening to cut me out entirely. I couldn't let that happen. Susan wanted to scream, wanted to jump out of bed and run, but she forced herself to lie still, to keep breathing steadily. Hannah understands, Michael continued. She's always understood me better than anyone, even better than you. Hannah! So Susan had been right about that connection. Hannah and I have been planning this for 2 years. Did you know she works for a pharmaceutical company now? Amazing what you can learn about medication interactions when you know the right people. Michael's confession continued, and with each word, Susan realized how meticulously planned Charles's murder had been. Hannah had provided information about drug interactions. Michael had gradually increased Charles's medication, causing confusion and memory problems. The final dose of insulin, disguised as Charles's regular heart medication, had triggered the fatal cardiac event. The beautiful thing about insulin, Michael explained, is that it's almost impossible to detect in an autopsy unless someone specifically tests for it. And why would they? 78-year-old man with a history of heart problems, natural causes. By morning, Susan had heard enough to know that her husband wasn't just a killer, he was a monster. And he was getting away with it. At breakfast, Michael acted like nothing had happened. He kissed Susan goodbye, told her he'd be working late again, reminded Emily to drive carefully. As soon as his car left the driveway, Susan called Emily. "We're going to the police. Today." But when they arrived at the Cedar Rapids Police Department, Detective Martinez listened to their story with polite skepticism. The text messages were suspicious, certainly, but they could have innocent explanations. The notebook could be related to Michael's insurance work. Without Charles's body being exhumed and tested for insulin, there wasn't enough evidence for an arrest warrant. "I understand this is difficult," Detective Martinez said, "but we need more than suspicious behavior and some text messages. We need concrete proof." Walking out of the police station, Susan felt defeated. Michael was right. He was going to get away with murder. That's when Emily had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Mom, what if we could get him to confess? What if we could record him admitting what he did?" Susan stared at her daughter. "Emily, that's incredibly dangerous. But it might be our only chance, and I think I know how to do it." Emily's plan was simple, but risky. She would pretend to know more about the murder than she actually did, would make Michael think she had evidence that could destroy him. If they could get him to confess while wearing a wire, the police would have to take action. Detective Martinez wasn't thrilled with the idea, but he agreed to provide Emily with a recording device. The plan was for Susan to confront Michael that evening, while Emily, wearing the wire, listened from the next room. That night, Susan felt like she was preparing for her own execution. She made Michael's favorite dinner, poured him a glass of wine, and waited for the right moment. "Michael, we need to talk about your father's death." Michael looked up from his pot roast. "What about it?" "I know what you did. Emily knows too." For a moment, Michael's mask slipped entirely. Susan saw something cold and calculating behind his eyes, something that made her wonder how she'd lived with this stranger for 30 years. Then Michael smiled. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "The insulin, Michael. The text messages with Hannah. The notebook with dosages. We have evidence." Michael set down his fork very carefully. "Show me." Susan's heart pounded. This was the moment of truth. "We've already given copies to the police." Michael's laugh was genuinely amused. "No, you haven't. Because if you had, Detective Martinez would have arrested me by now, instead of asking you to come back when you had more evidence." Susan's blood ran cold. How did Michael know about Detective Martinez? "You seem surprised," Michael continued. "Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies? I've been preparing for this conversation for weeks." He stood up from the table, and Susan noticed he was holding a small bottle. "The same insulin that killed Dad works just as well on healthy people, maybe even better." That's when Emily burst through the kitchen door. "Stay away from her." Michael spun around, startled. In that moment of distraction, Susan grabbed her phone and hit the emergency call button. "Emily, get out of here." But Emily stood her ground. "I recorded everything, Dad. The police are already on their way." Michael looked between his wife and daughter, calculating his options. Then he smiled again. "You know what the real tragedy is? I actually loved you both. But you couldn't just let sleeping dogs lie." The sound of sirens filled the air. Through the kitchen window, Susan could see police cars pulling into their driveway. Michael looked at the bottle in his hand, then at his family, then back at the bottle. "Michael, don't," Susan pleaded. But instead of taking the insulin himself, Michael lunged toward Emily. Susan didn't think. She grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her strength. Michael collapsed to the kitchen floor, blood streaming from a gash on his head. The insulin bottle rolled across the linoleum and shattered against the refrigerator. When the police burst through the door moments later, they found Susan cradling Emily while Michael lay unconscious on the floor. Surrounded by broken glass and evidence of his crimes, the trial made national news. "Insurance adjuster murders father for inheritance" was the headline in USA Today. The evidence was overwhelming once investigators knew what to look for. Charles's body was exhumed and tested. Massive amounts of insulin were found in his tissue samples. Hannah Stevens, facing her own charges as an accomplice, testified about her role in the murder plot. It turned out Michael's crimes went beyond just killing his father. He'd been skimming money from insurance settlements for years, forging documents, manipulating elderly clients. Charles had discovered some of these schemes and threatened to expose his son. Hannah had been Michael's lover since high school. Their relationship had continued even after both got married. She'd moved to Chicago to work for a pharmaceutical company, but they'd maintained their affair through secret meetings and coded messages. The plan to kill Charles had been Hannah's idea. She'd researched insulin overdoses, provided the drug, and helped Michael plan the perfect crime. What she hadn't planned on was falling in love with the idea of murder. During her testimony, Hannah admitted they'd been planning to kill Susan next, making it look like she'd committed suicide out of grief over Charles's death. Emily would have been next, ensuring that Michael inherited everything with no witnesses to their crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. Hannah received 25 years for her role as an accomplice. Susan and Emily had to rebuild their lives from scratch. The house on Maple Street held too many terrible memories, so they sold it and moved to Des Moines, where Emily finished nursing school and Susan found a job teaching at an inner-city elementary school. Today, Emily is a registered nurse specializing in geriatric care, just like she always planned. She says working with elderly patients helps her honor her grandfather's memory while making sure other families don't fall victim to the kind of elder abuse that destroyed hers. Susan never remarried. She says she lost her ability to trust completely, that she'll always wonder what secrets another person might be hiding. But she's found peace in her work, in her relationship with Emily, and in knowing that she found the courage to fight back when it mattered most. The Martin family hardware store was sold to pay for Charles's funeral expenses and Michael's legal fees. It's a coffee shop now, bustling with college students and young families. Sometimes Susan drives by and wonders what Charles would think about the new life his building has found. What haunts Susan most isn't the violence or the betrayal, it's the realization of how many signs she missed over the years. The times Michael volunteered to handle his father's medications, the way he discouraged Charles from certain social activities, the gradual isolation that made Charles more dependent on Michael for everything. I keep thinking about all the times I could have seen it, Susan told me when I interviewed her last year. All the opportunities I had to ask the right questions, to pay attention to the wrong answers. But you don't expect the person you love most to be capable of something so evil. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire story. It's not just that Michael Martin was a killer. It's that he was a killer who managed to hide in plain sight for 30 years. A man who coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, and never missed a church service on Sunday. The experts call it compartmentalization. The ability to separate different aspects of your personality so completely that you can be a loving husband in one moment and a cold-blooded murderer in the next. It's more common than we'd like to believe, and it's exactly why stories like Susan Martin's matter. Because somewhere out there, someone else is living with a monster and doesn't know it yet. Someone else is ignoring warning signs, making excuses for behavior that should raise red flags. Someone else is trusting completely when they should be questioning everything. I'm not saying you should become paranoid about your spouse or suspicious of every family member, but I am saying that love shouldn't make you blind to the truth, and loyalty shouldn't silence your instincts when something feels wrong. Susan Martin lost 30 years to a lie, but she saved her life by choosing to see the truth. Her daughter Emily lost her father and grandfather in the same terrible revelation, but she gained something invaluable, the knowledge that she's brave enough to do the right thing, even when it costs everything. As for Michael Martin, he sits in a maximum security prison in Iowa, where he'll spend the rest of his life. Prison records show he receives no visitors, no phone calls, no letters. The man who destroyed his family for money now has nothing except time to think about what his greed cost him. Hannah Stevens was released last year after serving 18 years. She lives in a halfway house in Minneapolis, working at a call center and attending mandatory therapy sessions. She's forbidden from contacting any member of the Martin family, and according to her parole officer, she's never attempted to do so. Charles Martin is buried in Riverside Cemetery, not far from the hardware store that bore his name for 62 years. His gravestone reads simply, "Beloved father and grandfather." He saw the truth. It was Emily's idea to include that last line, a reminder that sometimes the dead speak louder than the living, if we're willing to listen. The story of the Martin family is one of betrayal, murder, and greed, but it's also a story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter who refuse to let evil triumph. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one you trust the most. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about your own relationships or situations you might have overlooked, I encourage you to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate. If someone's behavior doesn't make sense, ask questions. And if you ever find yourself in danger, remember Susan Martin's example. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to fight back. Thank you for listening to this episode. The next story we'll explore takes us to the mountains of Colorado, where a family camping trip became a nightmare of survival that tested the bonds of love and the limits of human endurance. But that's a story for another day. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember the truth is always worth fighting for, no matter how much it costs. This has been another episode of True Stories That Matter. Don't forget to subscribe, share with friends, and leave a review. Your support helps us continue bringing you the stories that need to be told.